Welcome to the Lift and Make Lighter podcast. I'm Tom Telford here with Kevin Day, my co-host. This is cool.
This is fun.
Yeah, to have you in here.
Thank you.
Dr. Cory Reich, PhD, LMFT, all of it. All of the alphabet soup of smartness.
I don't know about that, but it's good to be here.
So good to have you. Thanks for coming.
You bet.
So much to cover today in our discussion, but I want to start with this. So last fall, I was at the Utah Coalition of Mental Health Professions Conference. We were all there, the three of us. And in that agenda, you showed up as a speaker, and I thought, I need to attend this. And as I sat at the back of that room that day, I was so impressed with a number of things that you said, but one of which drew me in, and I thought, we really need to spend some time with this really smart guy. And the topic was stress. And you linked how much sickness and disease is linked to this very thing we call stress. And because of my own story and my own journey, it really piqued my interest. But let's start there. And you can describe yourself, maybe intro yourself, but do it through the lens of why were you speaking about stress that day?
Wow, such a profound and wonderful topic. Let's just first set the stage.
Mm-hmm.
Over 90% of all doctor visits are related to the inability to cope effectively with stress. The majority, 7 of the 10 leading causes of death, are caused by stress response diseases. The irony of that, of course, is that we are dying in our effort to figure out how to live.
Yeah.
And so when you start looking at stress, you got to define stress. I mean, stress is obviously a universal phenomenon. All of us experience stress. And yet what the research really shows is that it's very individualized. It's idiosyncratic to each one of us. Because what stress is, now whether it's real, imagined, or anticipated, to the brain and the body, it's the same.
Still real.
Still real to the body. And it sees it as the same. And it triggers the corticotropin releasing hormone up in the brain, and it creates that stress response that, I mean, our body is made to handle stress in small moments and increments, not chronic and acute stress. So if we don't learn how to regulate our emotions and effectively cope with stress, that's why it starts to lead to all these problems of health and mental illness and diseases. So what we really have to understand is, so what is the real trigger of stress? Well, the trigger of stress is that when we identify the things that we really believe in, have value for, and are committed to, it's that quiet, oftentimes unspoken philosophy of, this is what life means to me and the good life. This is the desired life that I want to have, that if I live it, I'll be happy. I'll find joy in it. So anything that threatens those things that we deeply desire or believe in, that's what triggers the stress response. So if I want to be a wonderful athlete and I anticipate or identify or something imposes itself on me that negatively impacts my ability to perform, I'm going to feel stress. And the research shows that we have around 35 to 50 domains in our life that really matter. In other words, areas in our life that we literally define ourselves or our identity by. So when we look in the mirror, we don't just see a reflection of ourselves. We actually see an image that represents those things that most deeply matter. And so we consider and evaluate in that self-evaluation, well, how am I doing in my role as a husband or as a spouse or as a father or as a, an owner of a company or as an athlete. So those just kind of represent those domains. And then depending upon the importance or the value of that domain, the impact of that which threatens it will most deeply trigger the stress. I mean, right now, if you ask me how important my golf game is, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'll tell you it's like about a 2, right? Because I suck at golf. But so if I go out and golf and I I shoot a horrible score, it really doesn't bother me that much. I don't feel stress. But if I go home and my wife tells me that I'm ugly and incompetent and she doesn't want to be married to me anymore, that has a value on a scale of 1 to 10, a 10. Or if I sense that she's pulling away or something's going on where I don't evaluate myself as a good spouse, I'm going to start feeling super high levels of stress. And if I don't manage that effectively, then I'm going to be in a chronic acute state of stress.
Yeah. There's so much there to dive into because when, as a mental health business owner, and someone who's helping run the organization, Kevin's role, within LÉVO, we spend every day thinking about, talking about how do we help people who are struggling mentally.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that in our world today is that there's a spectrum of it. And so you've got situations, your career spans the spectrum, by the way, which is why I want to talk about it, because there are people who they don't have control over certain things that cause stress. They may be in an acute situation, traumatic event, your childhood, you had a very traumatic accident, a few accidents that occurred, which you can dive into as examples. But so you've got these situations of a child who has a traumatic, stressful event who is needing mental health care. But the opposite side of the spectrum is the professional athlete who's also struggling mentally, less acute, less traumatic event, but they've chosen to purposefully put stressors into their life because that's how you grow, right?
Yeah.
If you want to perform in the 7-game series of the NBA championships, you better be able to shoot foul shots under stress. Yeah. So we often get asked in the mental health space on this spectrum of I'm broken, acute versus performance, perform. And it's all in this mental health box, and your career has spanned that. So I'm intrigued to just talk through the spectrum of non-chosen stressors that you have to deal with versus those that are chosen and on purpose so that you can perform better. So I don't know if I just framed a question or, said 2 paragraphs, but
you framed it wonderfully. Yeah. So the research refers to stress in 2 different ways. One's eustress, that's EUSTRESS. That is what oftentimes is referred to as good stress or meaning-based stress. That's the stress you're talking about, like you decide to get a degree and you enroll in school and you feel all of the stress associated with that.
Yeah, Brainstoke would call it good hurt.
That's right.
Leaning into good hurt.
Yep.
And so you have to learn how to cope with that effectively, right, in order to perform optimally. But there is this aspect of that I willfully used my volition to choose that. And so I have a tendency to more often lean into that. Most people do. The other form of stress you're talking about is distress. And that's stress that we have no choice in, whether it's a pandemic or we get the pink slip at work or we get injured. I mean, whatever that is, we still have to learn how to cope with that effectively, right? But we didn't have any control over it happening. So what you've wonderfully identified, and this is something that people don't really recognize, our hope and our desire is not to have a life that's stress-free. Because as you already emphasized, growth itself is defined by moving beyond what we know and what we feel comfortable with. So we actually should always be pushing ourselves into a eustress environment. But we have to have confidence that we can lean into that, and in that self and situational trust and awareness, be able to make decisions and choices that we feel will influence that outcome, or we also are surrounded by resources that we know will be there to catch us and help us to move through that. So that's one aspect of the question that you asked. Yeah. There's another one that I think is extremely relevant, and it relates to across the board, understanding stress and coping with it, whether just in the daily routine of life, as well as whether you're a high-functioning person in sports or business or anything else. And that's neuroscience has shown us that when we look at the day and we approach the day, only 5% of the time during that day are we fully conscious and aware. The other 95% of the time, we're actually significantly influenced and see and emotionally get triggered and respond by what's referred to as stimulus response programs in the subconscious mind, or even on the unconscious level, things that we don't want to face that are outside of the realm of having access in our conscious mind to know what those are, but we can definitely feel the energy. Think of emotion as energy in motion, right? Exerting itself, that whatever that moment was that triggered that stress response or that emotion. So I was talking to you, Tom, before we started today. We're fairly libertarian. We, in our culture, really think that if you want it bad enough, you just make up your mind and just grit it up and make it happen. And so when I first read that research, I thought, no way. There's no freaking way that I'm only showing up 5% of the time. That makes me feel like I'm a victim, and I'm very anti-victim oriented about really owning and taking responsibility for my choices is what I live by. And so I didn't really believe or trust in that research, and I dug deeper, and unfortunately I found out that that was true. Now there's a reason for that. Our conscious mind processes about 40 bits of information per second, which sounds like it could be a fair amount. The subconscious and unconscious mind processes 40 million bits per second. So what's actually happening, because the subconscious mind is such a faster processing instrument, the conscious mind does everything it can to push things down to the subconscious mind, and through habits and habitualization and automaticity, free up the conscious mind to deal what's in the moment and allow ourselves to do the things that we do repeatedly and not even have to use the energy of the conscious mind to do it. So there's a super adaptive aspect of that. I mean, could you imagine if you had to relearn how to tie your shoes every day or drive your car or get dressed or do anything like that? So this habitualization or automaticity is created by learning how to build those programs. And so the question, and that I came to have to understand was, okay, if it's not about paying attention more because it's too exhausting, if you've ever really, really focused on learning a task, after about an hour of really deeply focusing and doing everything you can to learn, how do you feel?
Exhausted.
Exhausted.
And if you have ADHD,
you don't even last an hour. In fact, the normal person lasts about 15 to 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Right? So you can't sustain that level of attentiveness. And so in order to be able to be effective in life, you have to try to create as many habits as possible to not use up that energy in coping with that situation, right? And the way our brains and our bodies function is, well, in fact, let me go back first. So when we are young, our brain states, the brain state that actually is the most receptive and susceptible to developing these subconscious programs. Now, again, think of them as stimulus response records. So, something happens in the environment, and we, through repetition, have identified when those things show up or things like it, this is what it means, and this is the best way to respond to it. And that's creating that subconscious program, right? So it logs in. We got this huge library of these programs. When we're in our formative years, from the age of 2 to 3 to 7, your brain is in a brain state called theta. Now, a lot of people know theta if you do meditation and different things, because you're actually quieting your brain down, and you're putting your brain in a position to listen to those internal, intuitive, spiritual suggestions and get back in touch with what most deeply matters. And so it's a realignment, it's a recalibration. But what it's also doing is it allows you to kind of reorient or rewrite subconscious programs that are defeating and limiting or restrictive. Now, when we're growing up and developing in those formative years, from that 2 to 3 to 7, what we're really doing in that theta state is just this huge sponge, just pulling in everything that we're being taught of the way the world works. Right? The way relationships works, cause and effect, and everything else. Now, that's perfect if you're living in this wonderful, beautiful, nurturing, great environment. But you got two things. One, your cognitive capacities aren't very developed. So the meaning you're assigning and the narratives to all these experiences are not quite accurate. And it's also for those areas that are maybe hurtful or rejecting, or you create the message that you're not enough, it's inculcating, creating those subconscious programs too. So when we hit the age of 7 and our brain state starts to change out of theta and go to alpha, and right now you and I, we're all in beta, right? That those subconscious programs are exerting their influence, and we're really spending much of our lives trying to be aware of and rewrite those old stimulus response records that are exerting such a powerful influence. And if we're not paying attention, if we're not seeking to be aware that when certain things trigger us and it evokes a certain emotion, if we're not choosing to be consciously aware and challenging that messaging of those programs, they continue to exert their influence behind the scenes, and will continue to be victims of our past, both the narratives and the emotions. And so that stress response, the complicated nature of your question, is that it exerts its influence, as long as we're not paying attention to it.
Yeah.
And so if your mom told you, hey, or your dad, you're incompetent, you're never going to be smart at school, I mean, you might develop this horrible case of stress anxiety. So you might know the subject matter great, but then the minute that test gets passed out, you go into a stress response. Now, here's the thing that's scary about a stress response. The blood leaves the frontal cortex. So when you think of who you are and the way you look at life and the way you show up and do all the things that matter, your spirituality, your choice system, your connection, the analytic ability, the creativity, the ability to strategize and respond to a situation, that's all a frontal cortex function. Now, what happens when you really stress is the blood leaves that part of the brain. So you become performance impaired. It actually goes to the amygdala and the limbic system. And at that point, it's in that fight or flight mode. So it's all about getting out of that situation. It is kind of the biological stress response. It says, right now we're interpreting this situation as potentially life-threatening. You need to get out of that situation. And you literally become performance impaired. So if you have test anxiety, or you're an athlete and you're focusing on other athletes or what the conditions are, and you're distracted of being in the moment, you literally, that part of of your brain that you need to perform optimally, you don't have access to, right? And so then it just becomes get out of that stressful environment and get into an environment that you feel safe. Well, if you're an athlete, that doesn't work so good when you're in the middle of a race, right? You're not supposed to be thinking about how I can get done with this race. And what you're feeling is these emotions, well, why did I ever do this? And I'm looking at all the opportunity costs. I could be doing all these other things in my life. And you look at these professional athletes that they get really confused of why would they feel that way in the middle of a competition? It's because they're feeling stress and not regulating their emotion. And they got some kind of subconscious program that's anchored in survival first. So our brain and our body, first and foremostly, is hardwired to make sure that we survive. But our spiritual nature is the pull and the invitation to thrive and flourish. So in order to get past that survival mode and effectively cope with those stressors, especially eustress, we got to learn how to develop those subconscious programs in such a way that we can show up, lean in, have confidence that we can respond in a way that's effective, and then start moving to that belief system that we can actually flourish and not just survive. So that kind of answers your question, right? Around those people who have the real trauma experiences. A real traumatic experience, remember, through repetition and highly amplified emotional experiences, the way we build a new program, a new subconscious program. So a heightened stimulus response record that's defeating or limiting is what's caused by a traumatic experience. Let me give you an example. I was working with a retired professional athlete. He was a linebacker. He was working in the financial industry. He was actually at the Twin Towers at a meeting in New York, and he was in the second building that was hit. The first building got hit by a plane. He had actually gone down and was getting coffees for everyone in the meeting down at the bottom of the building, and he heard this big explosion and everything else, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And he went outside to see what was going on. And as he was outside and looking up, that's when that second plane hit the building. And he started running. And as he was running, he could smell, the fuel from the plane. And he thought that we were actually getting bombed because parts of the plane and the building were falling down and hitting the ground and shaking it. And he was running as fast as he could away from the building, and he got knocked down by an object. And as he went to get up and looked at it, it was the upper torso of a woman's body that was on the plane. And that whole experience created such a trauma response that he went and got a rental car. He was lucky to get that, and started heading across the country. And I was trying to help him regulate his emotions and kind of learn how to manage some of that stress that he was trying to navigate through, just so he could get back to Utah. And he started to do pretty good and regulate his emotions until he got to the first gas station. And as soon as he smelled that fuel, it triggered him back into that emotional response. So that's the example of a trigger that's attached to a smell. And by the way, olfactory is one of the strongest responses our body has to a memory. And then that trigger created that subconscious program. And so we had to help him try to restructure and rewrite that subconscious program as he was making his way across the country. And that's an example now of trauma, but the same thing happens conversely with positive experiences. So if I'm working with an athlete and we prescribe a way that they can approach a situation, and they are doing that in practice, and that approach produces a positive response, then that through repetition, they're creating that memory, right? And then they also create a highly emotional experience that then starts to ingrain itself in their mind. And eventually, if they do that enough, it starts to become automatic and habitual. And at that point, when they're in the race, they don't have to think about it. It becomes this intuitive response. So they do it automatically. And then they become more competent in their performance. Make sense?
Is that neuroplasticity? Is that what's
That's exactly
taking
what it
place?
is. And neuroplasticity, for those that are listening, is the ability for the mind to basically rewire neuronal connections. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're rewiring neuronal connections so that as you see that trigger, it hits that neuron and that synaptic connection changes and it creates a whole new route of thought and emotion and behavior.
Fascinating.
Yep.
So much there. When I think through in my head, just from what we see, it's interesting that distress, things that are happening with people, traumatic events that are going on, and they're struggling to be able to stay out of that. You called it the fight or flight mode. They're living in that mode. They're just trying to survive. It's so interesting that those people who are struggling in that situation are also utilizing the same tools and resources for performance.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a fascinating thing to kind of think through for what people are going through. Is that why so many people who have been through traumatic events that have overcome them, why that has actually become an accelerator for their performance?
Yeah.
Because it seems like so many high performers, when they get into their own story, mine is this way. I don't know that it's always the case, but my own story for where I am today is directly tied to traumatic events that I had as a child in school. All of that stuff that was traumatic to me became fuel. Why?
Yeah.
Why is it the fuel for good? Why is the struggle becoming so much the stoke later?
I'm loving what you're bringing up. If I say PTSD, everybody knows exactly what that means, right? But if I say PTG, do people know what that means?
I don't. Do you, Kev?
No, I'm interested.
It's called post-traumatic growth.
Oh, there we go.
And in reality, more people experience post-traumatic growth than post-traumatic stress disorder. So, Tom, what you just brought up is part of the power and the beauty of our human nature. And at the central part of that human nature is our spiritual nature. We talk about multiple intelligences in order to be able to look at life and engage in life and experience competency and optimum performance is what is the term, whether we call it that or peak experiences or peak performance. You have physical intelligence, or what's sometimes used as PQ. And then you have IQ, which most people know about, cognitive intelligence. You have EQ, which is your emotional intelligence, which is that ability to understand and be aware of and know how to manage your own emotions, as well as have that competency to be able to understand and see other people's emotions and respond accordingly and create that connectivity. And then the last one is spiritual intelligence. That's your SQ, oftentimes the most neglected of all the intelligences. And interestingly, that spiritual intelligence, what we see in the research, is that it not only augments and strengthens the others, but it unifies them to act in the most powerful way to accomplish that which is most deeply meaningful to us as a person. So what you just hit, in my opinion, is that we experience things in life, and what I like to call that is external things trigger internal awakenings. And what it does is it causes us to stand back, and the research supports this. It causes us to stand back and go, wait a minute. What are the things that matter most to me? Am I aligned? I mean, you go through a death or a divorce or a sickness or a tragic event, it really sets you on your heels, and you reevaluate what are the things that are most deeply meaningful. Now, if we're not dependent upon external things, if we're not externally defined, determined, independent, what really significant experiences do is they cause us actually to go inward, which is a beautiful thing, and it's a positive thing. It's a trigger to say, wait a minute, who am I? And what are the things that matter? What is my philosophy of life that I need to be engaged in specific things that I deeply believe in and have value for and I'm committed to, and I can commit to it and align with it. And so what you just described is your experiences cause you to awaken to those, recalibrate and realign. And so it brought out not only a redirection that lived with intention and purpose, but it started harnessing your internal resources and looking at the resources in your environment you could draw upon to help support you in that effort. That is more common than PTSD. And the beauty of that is you start to build your confidence that I am not going to live my life oppressed with anticipatory anxiety and worrying about the bad things that could happen. I'm going to live my life to create things that matter. And when hard things happen, I'll work with it then, but I have confidence I'll be able to lean in and work through it and or call upon my support system to help me through it. And at the end, everything's going to be okay. Until I can lean into life with that belief system that no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay. How can I lean into life?
Yeah.
And so what you're talking about with post-traumatic stress disorder, it's just simply complicated kind of bereavement and or trauma that has caused me to question my own capability and the safety of life. And I got to learn how to cope more effectively with that. And one of the side effects of trauma is hyperarousal. So we become hypersensitive to anything that would threaten our safety or our ability to survive. And that's what keeps us isolated and not being willing to get out there and have the courage to expose ourselves, because the emotional sense is that, man, if one more thing like that happens, I'm going to die. I'm not going to survive. And while that sounds irrational, that's exactly what you feel.
Mm-hmm.
You feel like, I can't. If that worst thing happens, I'm not going to make it. And so that belief system, that emotional kind of mindset has to shift to, you know what, the worst thing might happen, but I'm going to be okay. And until you can make that shift, it's going to be pretty hard to lean into life and dare to fail.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to have the ability to fail in order to succeed.
People's tolerance with that, if this doesn't go right, I'm going to die.
Yeah.
I'm much different than my wife, where she sees things from a different lens and maybe a little bit more concerned about what our kids are doing on the ski slope or whatnot. Where does that come from? Her breaking point versus mine? Is that due to my personal experiences of like, no, I've done that, we're going to be okay, or is that part of your kind of your DNA? That
kind of both your DNA and your life experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, in the psychology world, we call that the window of tolerance, right? What you feel like you have the ability to handle versus that which you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be deeply tied to your subconscious programs and to what degree they are based upon survival in your past experiences. And really, to some degree, to how have you developed your spiritual intelligence and are able to hear that call to pursue those things that most deeply matter and recognize that calling creates that purpose and intentionality, that your motivation is, that you don't see those things that challenge it as a barrier to stop you, but as an opportunity to accomplish the thing that most deeply matters.
Yeah.
I see that shift in the mindset of athletes and executives and high profile people all the time, that, they have to make that shift to always see the opportunity in everything. You have to get to the point where you don't categorize anything as being negative, even failure, right? The people who succeed the most are typically the people who fail the most. But what happens is they reframe and assign a meaning to that failure as the opportunity to learn. It doesn't have any indication or reflect my inability to succeed. It just says, okay, I learned from this. Now I can take from that learning and now move into that the next time with greater levels of competency.
Mm.
And so they always frame it as, okay, I have this opportunity to learn. I'm going to learn. And they lean into every experience in that way, in that mindset. And then they don't shrink and go the opposite direction. And so everybody has a different threshold. And again, that threshold, that window of tolerance is different in every domain, depending upon what area we're talking about. Some people have a large threshold of window of tolerance in certain areas of life, and then they don't have it in others, right? So I would be careful to say that it typically has a general meaning of someone's overall personality. It typically is in specific areas.
Life experience.
That's
and all
exactly
of that goes
right.
into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Is the ability to scaffold or expand the window of tolerance, is that resilience? Is that, emotional, strength? And is that really what's happening with the transformational power of pure intelligence? I mean, tie that together for us, because it seems like it's wrapped together.
It absolutely is. In fact, I'm gonna flip that a little bit by asking you two. You two have wonderful life experiences, and as you reflect back on experiences that you had that were painful or difficult or that required a tremendous amount of courage, how did you approach that, and what were your coping skills that you had to draw upon in order to achieve that?
Man.
Go ahead, Kev.
Mine's always going to default back to bike racing, which is like,
fine.
It's, and I will bring back a little bit in that discussion earlier where you mentioned kind of that test anxiety. I mean, that my whole public education career was like fight or flight. As soon as that test bubble sheet landed on my desk, it was like, all right, how fast can I fill out these bubbles and get out of here?
That's right.
Like,
ABBA.
No, for sure.
Right?
ABBA.
Oh.
Just do it.
I had philosophies on each one of, and it was a total wreck. And I had no kind of coping, and I probably could have passed the test really well. But anyway, but as far as that, the question goes in bike racing, it goes exactly to what you were saying with that muscle memory and the practice, repetition, and fundamentals. I had a coach that walked me through a lot of just drills before a particular race of, okay, if this goes wrong, what are you going to do? And we visualized it over and over. We didn't actually, go out and when you said that the statistic of 5%, I was like, that probably equates to all the bike racing that I did. There was probably 5% that were good, where I was like in tune and fully present. Yeah, because you think you try everything you can to get to that point in your life, and you prep for it, and you show up to these events primed and ready to go. My sense of smell at a bike race is, I've had smells that will come up, and I'll transform my whole visual into like where I am because of a smell. Your senses are on high alert, So, and then when those don't go right, they hurt real bad, because you put so much effort into it. But the ones that did are exactly like what you said, where there's this, you're so present, you don't even hear the crowd. You don't even know, like sometimes you don't even know what place you're in. You're just doing one thing after another, and it's like, what do I have to do to get to here? What do I have to do to get to here? And you're making those calculations that.
Yep. Beautifully. Can we actually build on that for a minute?
Please.
I use the word presocentric to address that concept of being present.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges that you have, and it certainly is transferable, doesn't exist just in racing, but it's everywhere in life. One of the problems with our world, and particularly when you're in competition, all the reward, all the emphasis is on what? At the end of the day.
Yeah.
How you finish in relationship to everybody else. That is the absolute worst thing for you to be thinking about as an athlete. To the degree that you're focusing on those things that could negatively impact you, and are focusing on another athlete and where they're at, is taking your focus and all your energy away from your ability to be in the moment, be competent in your ability to assess and strategically respond to optimally perform. So as you're working, or as I work with athletes, that is the biggest challenge, or executives or anybody, is that it's so easy to get distracted by those things that actually negatively impact your ability to be fully present. And then I have to ask you, so what do you trust when you are fully present? Right?
Yeah.
And that goes back to, Tom, to your question around your spiritual intelligence or that intuitive capacity. Of course, these athletes spend thousands of hours developing all the subconscious programs they can, so they're not having to, I mean, think about it. You got millions and millions of data points coming into your sensory capacities. And a lot of that is your central nervous system absorbing things that are going on below your level of consciousness. But that tsunami of information is saying, okay, your frontal cortex is saying, I can only handle 40 bits of information per second. So, of course, the theory is I want to try to create as many subconscious programs I can to absorb all that information that's happening, and that then creates this intuitive response. So I sense things, right? And now if I'm fully present in the moment, and I'm being able to identify what's happening with other athletes or the weather or the course or whatever else is going on, I'm not only in the moment performing in the presocentric stance, but also anticipating, right? And I'm not worrying about other athletes as far as individuals, but I am self and situationally aware. So the context, I'm fully present, understand the context, and then responding effectively and being proactive to perform optimally.
Mm-hmm.
What I have to trust there is not only that intuitive response, but that gut feeling. You know, you get a guy like Immanuel Kant that was a philosopher who said, we all possess this sublime nature. He called it a priori knowledge. In other words, there's often experiences in our life that we have this sense of knowledge, but nothing in our experience of life has given us that knowledge. Are we aware of that? And do we trust that, even in competition?
Mm-hmm.
And it really even doesn't have anything to do with a subconscious program, but has to do with that intuitive capacity to listen. And then when we respond accordingly, we're optimally performing at that moment. And we're just moment by moment, we're living. A great optimum performance, or at the end of the race, is 1,000,000 moments lived well. You can't live outside of any moment. And so the power of that moment is the most glorious, wonderful thing we can do. And when we're fully present in that moment, everything that moment has to give us, we can try to capture. And not only is that beautiful and wonderful, but it's educative. It will bless us and endow us with a knowledge of competency that the next time, because it was something we've never seen before, we tried to do our best, but it needs refinement, and we're going to refine it now. So again, that's a positive, right, narrative that we assign to that experience. And so we never walk away from a race with our heads down if we've given it everything we got. Now that might translate to standing on the podium or not. Mm-hmm. But no one can take that away from us. An optimum performance is an optimum performance. And as I've worked with very successful people, whether you assign success as making millions or running a wonderful company or winning a race, even if they accomplish that, if they haven't experienced that optimum performance we're talking about, left that world of being defined, determined, and dependent upon external things, but really discovered what that spiritual nature is for them, what they really deeply believe in, and been able to show up and be authentic and real. If that is not there, they still feel like their life is empty. Like it just isn't satisfying. It doesn't bring them that joy. Contrary-wise, if they do have that feeling, the outcome doesn't matter. I mean, that's a cherry on the top that things work out really well. Mm-hmm. But it's not filled with self-betrayal. It's not filled with selling ourselves in order to get something. It's about showing up and being authentic and learning what optimum performance feels like. And there is nothing that brings more joy and happiness than that. whether you're talking about a relationship or education or performance. That's what synthesizes all the things that you asked, Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Define it, if you don't mind. I mean, your book, The Transformational, or The Transformational Power of Pure Intelligence. I've only heard that word or words, pure intelligence, one other place. So I'm interested to know, without telling you where I heard that, or where I read it, actually. Describe it. Why that, and how does it tie in?
Yeah. Wonderful question. As central to the human condition, we are spiritual beings. Now, if we look at, and I'll get back into the mind for a minute, you have your conscious mind, and then you have your subconscious. We've talked about both of those. In the unconscious, we have the instinctive unconscious, which actually is tied very much to all of the biological systems that run automatically, as well as there's that part of the instinctive unconscious that typically is filled with some experiences that are filled with trauma or things that we need to change but we don't want to face, that impose their effect on us. But there's another part, and Viktor Frankl talks about this a lot in his book called The Unconscious God, and in other places, as well as others who have looked at this in-depth psychology. There's another part of the unconscious that's different than the instinctive, which is referred to as the spiritual unconscious, which is believed to be the habitat of our spiritual nature. And it's through that part of our nature, that spiritual nature, that these life forces that seek to exert their influence communicates to us through our conscience. So if we can learn to develop an aptitude or an awareness or a mindfulness of those suggestions that come from our spiritual nature through our conscience, that's that pure intelligence. That's that intelligence that emanates from our core nature that helps us identify what those things are that deeply matter to us. Because that's really what forms our identity, right? When you think about who you are, that's characterized by the things that deeply matter to you and the degree to which you're aligned to them. That spiritual call from our spiritual nature that influences and awakens us to those things that most deeply matter, they're not defined and determined by external things. Now, we're going to definitely be influenced by external things, but hopefully those external things do not define us or determine our sense of value and worth. This internal pure intelligence is an awakening to identify and recognize this life force that helps us recognize that we are not alone, that we are loved and supported. And the research around that is overwhelmingly clear that when it comes to looking at depression and anxiety and substance abuse and using any other mood-altering substance or behaviors, that coming to discover and understand our spiritual nature and allowing that pure intelligence to govern and guide us in our choices and our decisions is the greatest protective factor than any other intervention. There's no other intervention that will create greater healing and greater awareness and greater living with purpose and meaning. So when Bill and Bob in AA said, hey, addiction is a spiritual disease, they're absolutely right from the standpoint of when you're addicted to a substance, MRIs show us that a person in a craving state, the frontal cortex, just like stress, shuts down and the midbrain lights up like a Christmas tree and it governs our choices and decisions. What's interesting about the brain is executive functioning. We think that the frontal cortex is what has executive control, and that's what we normally, in a normal, healthy brain, looks like. But what's actually happening is the midbrain is letting the frontal cortex have decision-making power. But when it starts to read through stress, now going full circle back, that you are not managing your stress in a way that allows you to survive, the midbrain actually shuts the frontal cortex down, and it runs you to go do those things that release dopamine and allow you to alleviate that stress.
Default back to whatever coping mechanisms you have scaffolded or the lack thereof. I mean, you're going to default to whatever you've created in terms of your neuroplasticity, right? So if that's, whatever it is, I mean, it could be eating, it could be
That's right.
alcohol, drugs, whatever, or it could be exercise or reading or the other things. So is that what you're referencing? That, I mean, there is the default, right? What are you going to default to?
So what you're mentioning there is you're identifying, okay, what are my coping skills in order to be able to mitigate stress?
Yeah.
And anytime I engage in any behavior excessively, especially if it takes me away from those areas that allow me to show up to life and function, that's when that behavior can become dysfunctional or maladaptive, right? Whether it's shooting up heroin or golfing 8 times a week, right? So it can be any of those things. I mean, what we hope to do is to be able to identify healthy coping skills, both with distress as well as eustress, that allow us to regulate that emotion, keep the frontal cortex on, so our decision-making and being analytical and yet staying close to our moral and meaning-based decision-making is always intact. That's what we're wanting and trying hard to do, right? Then I can be really strategic and analytical and make really good choices and never deviate from my values. I differentiate values in 2 different ways. When we talk about those things that you believe and have value for and are be committed to, and remember, stress is any of those things that we perceive as threatening that. Values have 2 different aspects to it. One is value determinations. That's the way we assign value to people, places, or things, right? These are just the things that matter most to me. Value attributes, on the other hand, are character traits. That's the way I perceive that I need to be a good person. So being honest or hardworking or ethical. Now, over the course of a lifetime, my value determinations might change. When I was 14, basketball was a 10, right? And at 63, it's not a 10. If it does, I need to go back to therapy, right? So that isn't gonna work. So value determinations in those domains can change over the course of a lifetime. Hopefully my value attributes stay pretty consistent.
Yeah.
Right? Hopefully if I believe today that being honest is a value that I have, tomorrow I don't change my belief about being honest. And so that is a huge factor as it relates to some of the question that you ask. Okay, so if I'm coping with stress, am I coping with it in a way that it aligns me with things that I deeply believe in, have value for, and can be committed to? And if I'm violating my value system, it actually keeps me stuck in that safe place of self-betrayal and self-loathing and shaming. And then and that's part of the challenge with addiction or mental illness, is lots of times we cope with things in a way that actually is violating our sense of who we want to be. And that self-loathing keeps us in that negative spiral that we alleviated the stress for a moment, but then we created more stress because of that response. And then we go back to that mood altering substance or behavior in order to be able to manage it. So we got to break that loop.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me, just my lens, the way that I think, the way that I was raised. When I hear about the terminology and the connection to spirituality is the healing for both feeling broken or being broken and also performance. I have a hard time, in my head, when I'm broken, as a Christian, if I'm broken, I lean on spirituality. I lean on, Jesus Christ. But is that the same thing as shooting good foul shots? Like in my head, I have a hard time with that. And yet I have to be honest, in my own journey, in my own moments of deep reflection for accomplishment, one in which I sold a business a number of years ago. I was surprised at what happened that day, because I had a moment in time of recognizing, and it really was a question: how did I get here? And what I recognized is that I really wasn't present consciously. I was the 5%. And I recognized that day that, wow, how did I get here? And what I came up with was some amazing people. It really felt more like a spiritual journey to me than a scaffolding of an amazing company that was marketing driven. It felt spiritual to me.
Yeah.
Why? And in that day, I'll let you answer, but there was some pure intelligence going on that day in my office.
Absolutely.
As I reflected that, wow, there was something deeper going on here than just market timing and strategy and acquisition. It was less finance business driven than I ever would have expected.
Yeah. Back in 1997-ish, Dr. Kenneth Kendall did probably one of the first research projects of epidemiological research with spirituality and psychiatric symptoms. What was really cool about this research is that it was done with twins, over 1,900 twins in the Virginia area. And they wanted to really look at to what degree spirituality, first of all, is there a biological hardwire condition to spirituality? And if there is, how much of that is that way? And then how much is really regulated, influenced by societal or environmental conditions, as well as to what role spirituality plays. What they found was fascinating. He asked the question, and these were all adults, two questions around spirituality. One had to do with personal devotion, and it separates it from religiosity. It's like, to what degree do you look to spiritual sources to help you manage and guide you in your life, right? Whether it was prayer or meditation or being in nature or whatever. The other one had to do with how many times you go to church and are you aware of the rules and the way God works around blessing or punishing. What he found out is that adults make a very clear distinction between spirituality and religiosity. So you can be religious but not spiritual, right? Now, a lot of people, spirituality and religiosity kind of married and became one of the same things. But for others, it was separated. So you had the ones who really embraced spirituality, and that was referred to as personal devotion, and the religious group was personal conservatism. And what was interesting, what they found out in this research was that those who identified themselves as high in spiritual, they were 35 to 75% less likely to experience depression and anxiety. The other thing they found out was they had a much higher level of successful resiliency and coping skills with traumatic experiences in their life. The third thing that they found out was that they had a much lower frequency of looking to mood-altering substances and or being addicted to nicotine and alcohol. So in the study, they actually say, well, spiritually minded people actually don't get addicted. Here's the kind of the crowning finding of that research. And that was, as they found out now in twin studies, of course, the power of that golden standard is that we try to identify that which is genetically determined or what we're hardwired to do versus what is socially induced. What they found was that 29% of spirituality is literally innately created. So we are innately open to and desire and want to become conscious of spiritual forces. Now, that's fairly significant, right? We're hardwired. If any of the listeners haven't read Lisa Miller's The Awakened Brain, that's what she's really talking about. She said we really need to, and she's a researcher out of Columbia who did some wonderful, fascinating research. And that is, we really need to come to understand that the brain is maybe not so much of a thought generator, but an antenna or a docking station to receive and hear these spiritual suggestions and prompts from our spiritual nature. And that our health and well-being is more closely knit to and tied to this sense of spiritual awareness and spiritual intelligence than any other factor in our life. So we really do have to become conscious of those spiritual forces. I mean, if you look at some of them, and the minute you say quantum physics, people kind of run out of the room or go to sleep. But when you look at some of the research there in quantum physics, it's so wonderful and so beautiful. But I just want to refer to one study. One gentleman was able to identify, he's a German physicist, and what he was able to identify is that every living organism from the most simple single cell like a plant to the most sophisticated and complicated of the human being, emits a stream of light from our presence. And that light is the communication system both within the organism and between organisms. He called that biophoton emissions. That's the photon is what's actually emitting the light. So what that means is that this light, not biochemicals, literally orchestrate and cause the communication within the body and between organisms to communicate. That has profound significance. It literally acts like a tuning fork that communicates on a cellular level how molecules and atoms in your body work to be coherent and healthy. And then it also translates to we send signals out to the universe, and the universe sends signals back through these communications of electromagnetic signatures, what it's referred to. Another physicist, his name is Niels Bohr. He's actually a Danish physicist. He came to identify in quantum physics, it's called non-locality. And what that means, or quantum entanglement, is that once these subatomic particles come in contact with each other, they are cognizant of one another and influence and communicate with each other no matter how far apart they are and or through any amount of time. And what all this translates to is that this light or this energy or life force is in and through all things. We never act independently. We're influencing and affecting each other all the time. And what the research really shows is that don't think of your spiritual intelligence as a self-generated thought process. Spiritual intelligence is literally raising our consciousness to that influence of that life force that's communicating to you that you are known, that you are loved, and that you are supported, and that you're not alone, ever. You are a part of this beautiful field of communication and interrelationship and interdependence that we all influence and affect each other. And when you look at spiritual intelligence, what I love about what you shared, Tom, is that at that critical moment where you became self-reflective, you came to start to really, I'm sure you did this beforehand, but that experience reawakened you to the fact that your spiritual intelligence is about using your gifts and talents and efforts to bless those that you love or to do a work to make the world a better place. That's what spiritual intelligence is. That's what being true to oneself is. I'm very concerned that in our culture and our society that people label being true to oneself, that translates to being self-centered, when in reality being true to ourselves, especially if we're spiritually intelligent, is really about self-transcendence, to be meaning-centered and spiritually oriented. Then the impetus behind our behavior, the waking up in the morning, is not to say, how many likes did I get, or how popular am I going to be, or how much money can I make? It's about how can I act in such a way that it strengthens and blesses people that I love and or makes the world a better place. That's the expression of spiritual intelligence. And Tom, when you share the experience that you just had, that's what I heard. That's why you would label that as spiritual experience. I would say that is exactly what it was.
Yeah.
What an incredible definition of spirituality versus, like you mentioned before, how most of us probably think of it. Yeah. And that last statement you said was that's kind of what this book has helped me realize, that word spirituality and my spiritual intelligence, all that, it was all related to religion, but it's so far from it.
Yeah. It can lead us to it and can lead us to practicing it, but it's separate. Mm-hmm. Now, here's something interesting for those who have adolescents and or are parents of adolescents. Another research project out of Virginia, they looked at the comorbidity in teenagers as it relates to spirituality. And what in that research found is while adolescents did start to begin to distinguish between spirituality or personal devotion and personal conservatism, in other words, religiosity and plugging into that religious orientation of life, the separation was much, much less. So there's this developmental process of our spirituality. And in those teenager years, just like many of the other aspects of competency, be they physical or cognitive or emotional, they're really trying to identify and be conscious of, what does spirituality mean? And am I going to choose to believe in that life force and that energy, and to be able to develop that spiritual intelligence in my life? Now, in that research, it found that that sense of spirituality, those teenagers that reported being spiritual or having a high priority around that spirituality, had a 40 to 80% protective factor against depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. So if you're a parent,
That's huge.
or you're a treatment provider for adolescents, you better believe that spirituality needs to be a central part. And that's a really hard thing, because, you always want to come to your client and orient your approach around where they're at, and not impose, of course, any of those issues on
The
them.
15-year-old who walks in and you're talking spirituality and they're just like, okay, tuning fork guy.
I'm
Are you
out.
serious?
And so sometimes you just have to use different language.
Yeah.
You talk about that intuitive capacity, that sublime nature, what resonates. I mean, when I was at a treatment center and I designed an entire treatment protocol around helping clients come to identify and listen to this intuitive response of identifying what really deeply matters and to what extent are they aligning to it. We did that baseline where we assessed their depression levels, their anxiety levels, and the extent to which they perceived the need to use mood-altering substances to cope with stress. And what we found, and this was over 800 respondents, both from ILP to PHP, and these, of course, had comorbidity issues, substance abuse issues, as well as mental health issues. There was a very high correlation that as they began to see and recognize and embrace those things that most deeply mattered, and then started to harness their choice system and leverage their own resources and the external resources to move in a direction to try to create fulfillment in those, guess what happened to their anxiety levels?
I'm assuming that they transformed.
Yeah.
And depression. And what happened to their attitudes around looking at and needing mood-altering substances to regulate their emotions to cope with the challenges and the stressors? Yeah. All those significantly went down. And that was especially relevant to me because as you look at the barriers to spirituality, somebody who's in post-acute withdrawal and some of the neurological adaptive issues that happen in addiction, that was a heavy lift. So I was extremely excited to see that when you work with them and you help them as their brain heals and they start to, that frontal cortex comes back on and they start awakening back to life, for them to start to explore what are the things that really matter. And that's hard to do when you're navigating through a whole bunch of years of wreckage.
Yeah.
Right? But as they kind of peel the curtains back, let the light in the room, and kind of just try to shelf all that wreckage and just say, okay, what are the things that most deeply matter, and where's my hope in my effort to be able to make choices to influence that? That had everything to do with their healing process and their sustainability of recovery. Everything.
Wow.
That is fascinating to me.
Incredible.
Hearing you describe that and even trying to apply it in my own life. But when I think through my own journey, it's shedding so much light on what transformed, transformational, the power of transformation being tied to this very thing.
Yeah.
And I've never even thought that my spirituality was really centered in the things that matter most to me. Because I've always viewed it through a lens of, to your point, the religiosity. Mm-hmm. What are the things that matter to my church or that leader who said so much about this, instead of just what is my own truth? What matters to me? Say more about, or ask your question. Or make a
I feel
comment,
like
Kev.
I'm way more spiritual than a lot of people that I am.
I'm so spiritual.
My spirituality is like way up here. That other stuff, who knows?
Well, and that's something that I respect both of you in so much. Ever since I've met you both, you really do exude. You emit a clear. I mean, that's both literal, guys. We emit a electromagnetic aura about us from our spirituality. You can't fake that. I mean, to be spiritually minded, you sense that in people. You sense people when they're oriented around deep meaning that is manifested not by external things, but by an internal motivation, that they really are meaning-centered and spiritually oriented. And both of you guys bring a presence to your work and an energy that is that. It's extremely inspiring and inviting. It's disarming. It disabuses. And that's what we need. We need this kind of collaboration. We need to give messages to people that there is hope. But that hope is not by looking to external things to accomplish it. It really is going inside and doing that internal work and orienting around that and challenging that shame or that enoughness. We were talking about before we did this interview, you asked me the question, where does fear really come from? And stress, which would be associated with fear. And I mentioned Brené Brown's research that, first we have to ask ourselves the question, what requires more vulnerability? Loving someone or letting them love us? And when you ask that question, most people, their first knee-jerk response is, well, it's to love them. And actually, no. Greater vulnerability is required to let someone in, allow them to see you for your true self, right? To see and be seen and know and be known is what describes connection and real emotional intimacy. If we don't feel worthy, is what Brené Brown found, is if we don't feel like we're enough, if we don't feel like when people really get to know us, they're going to love us or like us, we don't let people in. We'll love them, but we won't let them love us. And what's even worse or scarier is because we don't trust our authentic nature to be enough, what I end up doing is trying to read you and read the room and try to be what you want me to be in order to be enough, to be loved. Now, here's the worst part of that. Even if you do like me and love me, that makes things worse for me. Because I worked so hard to be who you wanted me to be in order to be liked. Now, if you ever find out that I'm really not that, it's even worse. So it creates more stress if I get what I want, right? And that's why, so for many people, love or connection or relationships they want it more than anything, and yet it's the most exhausting thing that they have in their life because they're not showing up and being authentic. You can't allow that love in and have it have that beautiful, powerful, transitory effect that it's just, I'm not alone. And I'm walking with people who know me and love me no matter what. They accept me and embrace me, and they see me not only for who I am, but who I can become. I mean, what a sad way to live life. But that fear originates in that emotion or that belief that I'm just plain not enough. And so I don't let you in. And that is anchored in that sense of not being worthy. Well, as you develop your spiritual intelligence, what happens to that sense of worthiness? It chases it away.
Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah. And what needs to happen, and I don't know how we are in time, but this is profoundly important, and I tell clients this all the time, and that is until we can show up to life and have the self-confidence and self-trust that no matter what happens, I'm going to be real and authentic, I'm not going to be able to ever show up. Not authentically, not transparently. I'll step into that codependent stance that we were just talking about. And what a stressful way to live life. Now, again, it goes back. I'm going to show up and be honest and transparent. I call it a 2-4 principle. My responsibility is to show up to this relationship and be aligned with the agreements that we make that define the context of that relationship. And I got to be responsible for me and for my emotions. But am I responsible for you?
No.
Am I responsible for what you feel of me or think of me?
No.
No. And until I can let go of that, I can't show up and be real and authentic. I can't be healthy or strong. And so I have to be able to show up to life in that 2-4 principle and in that authenticity to say, hey, my self-trust and my self-confidence is anchored in my spiritual intelligence, and I am to give myself permission to show up. And yeah, I want certain people, I want to develop those relationships, but it's always going to be predicated upon my ability to be honest. And if that happens and we enjoy each other in that way, then it's something beautiful and rich. And if you say you don't want to have a relationship with me, I'm going to be sad. I'm not going to like it, but I'm not going to walk away having self-betrayed or feeling like that's a reflection I'm not enough. And that's the only way to overcome that fear that you asked me about.
Yeah. I'm trying to think through just my own relationships. I'm even scanning through that, those that are strong and connected, and there is radical honesty.
That's right.
That is going on in me, the way that I show up and the way that they show up, but more so just the way that I walk away from that relationship feeling like,
yeah,
I was okay regardless of the outcome, and that's a hard place to be. I'm married to an American family therapist. And so, when you think through those things about authenticity and vulnerability, and as much as I think about those things into my relationship to others and how valuable that is, but to self, to my own, truth. So finish on this. Go to the crux of the book and just tell us the thing that you think is the brilliance in there. I know there's a lot, but speak to that.
Yeah, boy, this is that elevator pitch that I'm not sure I've refined. Here's what I would probably say. You possess the answer. The most powerful resource that constitutes the beauty that exists within you is your spiritual nature. And to the degree that you understand that and tap into that, it will free and transform your life in ways that you don't even dare to dream. You don't even know how to imagine. Because we live in a culture and a society that we're so externally defined, determined, independent, that we just so neglect and underdevelop that spiritual competency. As we develop that spiritual competency, it unleashes potential in a way that your physical intelligence, your emotional intelligence, and cognitive intelligence is optimized and unified and synchronized in a way that it lifts life so far above surviving. It really leads to a soul set of thriving and flourishing. That's why we're here. And I think we got to create that trustworthiness in each other's relationships, be able to create an environment that we're worthy of each other's stories and allow that to be developed. It's hard. It's hard work. It's not something that comes without, like anything else in life. It requires intentionality and purpose, but man, is it worth it. And it requires that understanding of what is the work I got to do in order to be conscious of those things that most deeply matter. Am I taking the time to meditate? Am I taking those walks? Am I getting clarity of thought? Am I really listening? And then do I have the courage to show up in the integrity of that? And am I doing that repeatedly? So I'm building all those subconscious programs to draw upon my true nature, because it requires all of that and it takes time. So be patient, be kind to yourself, show yourself that grace. But the one thing I can promise is you're not alone and you're known, loved, and supported.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for lifting and making lighter. I mean, that's what this is about, and brain stoke, the stoke that comes along with, this journey of finding honesty and pure intelligence and all of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me the privilege to be here with you guys.
Wonderful
Appreciate the work you're
conversation.
doing. Thank you.